Hey guys, at this point, if you've been a Scrabble fan for any amount of time, you probably know that the greatest Scrabble player of all time is none other than Nigel Richards. Part of what makes Nigel Richards the greatest Scrabble player of all time is his virtually flawless endgame skills. Endgames in Scrabble are unique because they're the only part of the game where there's no randomness, as you know exactly what you and your opponent each have for the rest of the game. In part due to that lack of randomness, there's a need for concrete calculation in endgames which can make them super duper complex, and nobody on the planet is better at solving them under pressure than Nigel Richards. I've already made multiple videos on Nigel's endgame brilliances. For instance, check out his setup for the 10-letter athleisure he did earlier this summer at the WGPO World Cup that was featured on both my channel and Will Anderson's. But this endgame I'm about to show you guys today might even be more amazing and complex from a strategical standpoint. It happened at the Scrabble Players Championship this past summer in round 11 against David Spargo, a very strong expert who's rated over 1900. David had just played the word yipe to empty the bag and enter the endgame with a 39-point lead by a score of 331 to 292. Nigel was sitting on a rack of AADENOS, and he knew from his tile tracking that David's tiles were the 6 unseen on the right, HNRSUZ. At first, it seems like it's going to be virtually impossible for Nigel to come back and win this game, since 39 is a pretty big deficit, especially considering he's got all 1-point tiles except for his 2-point D. However, a closer look at the unseen tiles reveals that David might be having some issues of his own on the other side of the board, in particular with the Z. There are very few places on this board that David can play his Z, and he runs a significant risk of being Z-stuck. If David ends up stuck with the Z, then David is never going to be able to play out, and Nigel can slow play, taking his time, accumulating a lot of points, and eventually, after going out, a 20-point bonus for David's unplayed Z. And that looks like it might be the key to any chances Nigel might have. It turns out that David has a single spot for his Z, namely Zin or Zins through the eye of Oribi, using his N and possibly his S. So, Nigel naturally would want to block this. Even something like AI for just 2 points makes a ton of sense here. After this play, David will be unable to play his Z for the rest of the game, and Nigel still has 6 tiles he can work with to try to rack up as many points as possible. After this play, David's best response appears to be Hugh for 23 points. Again, he can't play his Z, but he can at least use his H for a nice score and increase his lead to 60 points. And it turns out that 60 points is simply too much for Nigel to make up. The thing is, while David is stuck with the Z, he still has some other tiles to work with, the N, the R, and the S. And this is a good thing for David, because it kind of stops Nigel from taking his time with impunity. Since while Nigel can take a lot of turns to try to rack up more points, if he takes a lot of turns, David can also rack up points using his non-Z tiles. So it's actually in Nigel's best interest here to not take forever and minimize the amount of points David can also rack up. According to Macondo, Nigel's best response in this position is the 22-point play of S, making Joe and Hawes on the F column. After this, David can use his N to score 10 points with Benny, saving still the R and the S for additional points if Nigel decides to slow play even more. Nigel here should not slow play, he should just go out with Dona for 17 above Nettie, and that's going to fall short. When all is said and done, David will hold on to win by 7, 364 to 357, despite Nigel having gotten 24 bonus points from David's unplayed RSZ. So now if we're in Nigel's shoes, we go back to the drawing board in the original position, and we're probably thinking, okay, AI didn't quite work, but it wasn't that far off. After all, we only lost by 7 points after AI. So maybe there's a more efficient way we can play in the same area of the board while still Z-sticking David. However, the problem is there really isn't, because it's difficult for Nigel to score much more. He can score more with a play like Nosed and Aribis, but the problem is now he's using 5 of his tiles and he only has 2 tiles left with which to rack up points in the stick endgame, and this is also not going to be enough. If Nigel plays Nosed, then David is stuck with the Z and only 19 points up, which seems scary, but he can just calmly play Hugh for 23 as he did before, and Nigel now, with only 2 A's, has nothing better than to play out with AA for 9, and he's once again losing by 7 in this line, despite getting 26 bonus points from David's unplayed tiles, 347 to 354. It turns out that it's impossible for Nigel to play in that part of the board in a way that Z sticks David and gets him enough points in the endgame. So, unfortunately, that means that Nigel is going to be unable to win this endgame, as clearly, if David's able to play his Z, and he's already up almost 40 points, Nigel is going to be completely powerless to overcome this deficit. Right? Well, not so fast, says the greatest Scrabble player of all time. In this position, Nigel did not block David's Z play. He instead made a play on a completely different part of the board, N, making Joe an on for 18 points. This play looks utterly insane. After all, he's letting David play his Z when he doesn't have to let David play his Z, and he's also getting rid of two of his seemingly strongest tiles on his rack, leaving the clunky-looking AADOS. So what on earth does Nigel have in mind here? Well, the problem for David becomes apparent when he starts thinking about his Z plays. In this position, David points out that he was absolutely shocked to see Nigel's play come down. David was rightfully assuming that Nigel was going to Z-stick him. But then David saw the issue. If he plays either Zin or Zins, he's giving Nigel massive counterplay, because Nigel is going to hook the Z to make Za on the double word score and play vertically with the Arabies, getting over 30 points. And David now has a choice to make. He's in Zugzwang. He can either play off his Z and let Nigel come back with a big play, or not play off his Z, in which case he once again runs the risk of getting Z stuck on his next turn. Let's first look at the line David chose during the game. He has two ways to get rid of his Z. As I mentioned, he can play either Zins or Zin in this spot. He decided to play Zin. Let's see what happened after that. After Zin, Nigel responded with Aaz, Za, and Aribis for 36 points. In that spot, he just baited David into setting up for himself. Nigel now takes a 1-point lead, and David responds optimally with and for 20 points, scoring well and getting rid of his 4-point H. David is now up by 19, but Nigel goes out with Dawn and Do for 16. Note that he could have gone out for 16 in a different spot as well, the slick Bendy, inserting the D between the Ben and the Y, Do and Oi. He chooses this one, it doesn't matter. Nigel gets 16, he's still down 3, but guess what? He gets 4 points from David's unplayed R and S, and after all that, Nigel Richards wins this game by a single point, 366 to 365. Wow! Absolutely incredible stuff. What I think is the most remarkable about this endgame, guys, is that Nigel had the opportunity to Z-stick David, and he won by purposefully not Z-sticking David. So this illustrates an important but very rare concept in endgames. Sometimes, as powerful a tool as sticking is, it's better to not stick, especially in cases like this, where your opponent's only play with the tile they'd otherwise get stuck with gives you massive counterplay. And Nigel utilized that concept here to perfection. But we're not done yet. This is what happened during the game, but it still begs the question, is there anything else David could have done to respond to Nigel's play of N besides playing Zin? Before we jump into that, it's instructive and relevant to address a question some astute viewers may have been wondering about. After David's play of Zin, in this position for Nigel, why did he play Aaz immediately, giving David the big spot for his H? Why didn't he play Do first, saving Aaz for his next turn and depriving David of a good H play? The answer is because David, still holding his S, can actually block Nigel's outplay. He can sacrifice points and play Ns and Sh for just 8 points, after which Nigel's best outplay scores only 12. Nigel goes out with Aaz and Ha for 12 points, and it's easy to see he's going to lose by a lot. So because David has the ability to block, that's why Nigel has to play Aaz immediately after Zin. That is not the case, however, if David plays Zins in the original position, and this is why I wanted to show you guys that sideline. After Zins, Nigel actually wins only by playing off his D and his O first, not by playing Aaz first, so the complete opposite of the line after Zins. Why? Well, if Nigel plays Aaz first, then we follow the same trajectory as we followed during the actual game. David responds with for 20, and Nigel goes out with Do for 16. However, here, instead of a 1-point Nigel win, it's a 5-point David win, because David scored more points with Zins than Zin and also got rid of his S. So instead of playing Aaz immediately, Nigel now has to play Do for 16 first, depriving David of the better spot for his H. And now, this is the brilliance. Because David spent his S, he doesn't have that resource of playing Ns and SH as he did in the previous line I showed you guys. So now, David is completely powerless to block Nigel's play of Aaz on his next turn. The best he can do is for now just 12 points above the N and the E of Nettie, and now of course Nigel goes out with Aaz for 36, and ends up winning this game by 3, 364 to 361. The biggest difference here was that by being able to switch the order of his plays, Nigel turned David's 20-point into just a 12-point and those 8 points were more than enough to swing the outcome of this game. So what that means, guys, if we go back to the position after Nigel's seemingly counterintuitive, but also seemingly brilliant play of N, David is in Zugzwang here. He cannot play his Z with Zin because, as in the actual game, Nigel responds with ah-ahs and wins by 1. He cannot play his Z with Zins because, as we just saw, Nigel switches the order of his plays, plays Do first, and then goes out with ah-ahs and wins by 3. So that means David here cannot play his Z if he wants any chance to win this game. The problem is, if he doesn't play his Z, then he runs the risk of being Z-stuck once again. But hey, if he knows playing his Z is not going to win, he might as well try. If David elects not to play his Z here, he's got several options. Note that David's standout play from the previous lines we looked at, Haw and Hugh on the left-hand side of the board for 23, has been taken away as Hawn is not a valid word. So another subtle but very important benefit of Nigel's initially curious-seeming play of N. David's highest scoring play here appears to be Rush and Arabes for 22. This would be a terrible play because David gets rid of almost all of his tiles other than his Z, and he loses the ability to counteract Nigel's slow play sequences that are going to rack up a huge number of points. So even though David takes an over 40-point lead with this play, he's going to end up losing by a lot. Nigel's best sequence appears to be the sneaky Da, Bendy, and AI for 16, after which David's best response is only 2 points for Un. After this, David is going to have no more plays and he's going to have to keep passing. And Nigel can get a lot of points with each of his remaining 3 tiles individually. He can do So and Ox for 13, David passes. Then he can drop his S with the obscure Bendies for 13 points. David passes again, and Nigel now goes out with Awa and O. And Nigel has already surpassed David, and that's without the 20 bonus points for the Z. Nigel wins comfortably 381 to 355 in this line. A much more competitive option for David would be Nth in the bottom left corner, scoring comparably with Rush while keeping a few more tiles for David to work with in the event Nigel decides to slow play. However, the drawback with Nth is that from Nigel's perspective, now he doesn't even have to spend a turn blocking Zin, because David has gotten rid of his N, and as such, David has no Z plays anywhere on this board, regardless of what Nigel does, unless, of course, Nigel does something really silly and gives him a spot for ZA, which he's never going to do. A long, complicated sequence ensues here that, according to Macondo, is optimal for both players. Nigel drops his S with Beats and Agas, preventing David from using his own S in the same spot, and David uses his S now for loans and S, scoring 1 fewer point than Nigel got for his own S. Nigel now responds with So and Ox, grabbing 13 points for his O, and David responds with Mun, getting 6 for his U. Nigel now can go out with Dada for 11, and this would win by 2 points, however it's not optimal. He continues slow playing with Dawn for 10, as David of course can't do anything with his Z. David makes one final play, Rem for 5 with his R, and Nigel once again takes his sweet time playing off his 2 A's. He plays Awa and O for 9, David passes, and Nigel finally goes out with Ah and Da for 8 points, and when all is said and done, Nigel will win by 11, 382 to 371. So, Nth, a much more valiant effort than Rush, and certainly requires a more complicated sequence from Nigel, but it's still not going to work for David. The last idea David might consider in this position is, what if he makes a play that saves his N, so that he's still threatening Zin on the next turn, and he forces Nigel to address that in some way, whether blocking or ensuring he leaves his A's to respond to it. So one cool idea for David here might be to play Thrawn between the T and the On that Nigel just opened for 13 points. This also blocks Nigel's play of Dawn and Do, which he was looking at in a couple of those lines. This seems a little more promising than Nth, but no surprise, it's still not going to work. Let's see why. Nigel actually has 2 winning paths in this position. He can either Z-stick David or use the same winning tactic he used in the actual game of letting David play Zin or Zins at a large expense. Let's look at the latter first, since I think it's more fun. Although his Dawn and Do spot got blocked, Nigel still has that sneaky spot for Do with Bendy and Oi for 16 points. After this, it's easy to see that if David doesn't play his Z, Nigel's going to go out and win easily, so David has nothing better to do than play Zins for 18, but this allows Nigel the huge counterplay, as we saw earlier, of Ah-ahs making Za and Arabes for 36, tying the score, but then Nigel wins by 2 after getting 2 bonus points for David's unplayed U, 364 to 362. According to Macondo, Nigel can also win after Thrawn, and gets a few more points by doing so in the form of Z-sticking David, optimally with do's and aribis for 16. David's best response here is agas and beats for 12, any longer play, and that gives Nigel the flexibility to slow play his 2 A's, so this, according to Mikando, is best for David. And now Nigel goes out with and da for 10 points, bringing him to 336. He gets 24 from David's unplayed NUZ, and Nigel ends up winning by 4, 360 to 356. So, in the original position, while Thrawn is a cool and very valiant effort against N, it's still going to fall short if Nigel either plays with Bendy or Z-sticks David. So, what does that mean, guys? That means that N is amazingly a winning play for Nigel Richards. David has nothing to do here. He is in complete Zugzwang. If he plays his Z as he did in the actual game, then, as we saw, Nigel is going to score too many points in return. If he doesn't play his Z, then he either gets Z stuck and loses, or, in some cases, falls victim to the same tactic on a future turn. So, David is completely lost here. And the amazing thing is it appears that if we go back a turn to where Nigel played EN, this seems to be Nigel's only winning play in this position. The super difficult to spot, super innocuous looking, super counterintuitive N for 18 points, keeping the duplicate A's and completely ignoring David's spot for his Z. I think there are very, very few players on the planet who would come up with such a counterintuitive idea in this position. If I had enough time, maybe I would see it if I could reason out that my Z-sticks weren't enough to win. I think anyone here first naturally thinks to Z-stick David, since after all he only has one spot on the board. And normally, if you can stick your opponent with a 10-point tile, you want to stick your opponent with that 10-point tile. But this situation is anything but normal, and Nigel Richards picked up on that in brilliant and spectacular fashion in a position where I don't know if anybody else picks up on that. So absolutely amazing stuff from the greatest Scrabble player of all time, and by extension, the greatest Scrabble endgame player of all time. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Shout out to David Spargo, by the way, on posting this game and admiring it, even though he lost. Shows a lot of class, and I think it's super cool to be on the end of something like this, seeing such brilliance from the greatest player to ever do it, even if the result doesn't go your way. So shout out to David once again for posting this brilliant endgame. Shout out as well to all of you guys for watching. Really appreciate your support. Please consider leaving a comment or a like or subscribing if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow. Thanks again, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found it instructive. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all soon for the next one. Bye-bye.